As a brief introduction before handing over to Paul, I'm Alex. I head up the cyber practice here at Chaucer. I've been here with Chaucer just over 2.5 years. And Chaucer, as I'm sure at least some of you are aware, or we all know, have over 30 years of experience delivering human-centric digital transformation across multiple industries and various sectors. And that human centricity may give you a hint on where our focus will be this afternoon as we talk our way through how you deal with ransomware and build that resilience. Just before handing over to Paul, who will be presenting the vast majority of this afternoon's webinar, just 3 housekeeping points. Feel free to raise your hand or indeed post questions into the chat as we go through the presentation. We'll endeavour to open up the question as we go through, so raise questions as we go through. I mean, if that's not possible, then we will have a Q&A session or time for questions at the end as well. As Paul mentioned just now, if you could please mute microphones when you're not talking or presenting, that would be great. It's just to prevent any sort of background noise coming through. And the last point is that we are recording this session. If you don't feel comfortable, then I guess feel free to drop off. And what we can definitely do, if that is the case, and indeed, even if for those of you that hang on, we'll be able to send the recording out afterwards. Should you want to catch up on it. We'll stop recording for the question and answer session at the end, just to hopefully free up people's ability to ask questions. That's it, I think, from me. So at this point, I'll hand over to Paul so he can give his introductions, and we'll get going with the webinar, unless there are any questions at this point. I shall take silence as a good thing. And Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate that. My role at Chaucer, I'm a cybersecurity specialist. I'm also very much involved in data ethics and data protection as part of our data practice. So this webinar is designed to provide an overview of all of the steps that should be necessary in your planning for your business or enterprise coming under attack from ransomware. This isn't about technology. We're going to be looking at legal aspects, regulatory, business risk, financial, criminal, and business continuity topics. The presentation wasn't designed to be a generic one-size-fits-all, but typically we would tailor it for a single enterprise. So we'd deliver a presentation like this to a customer and then customize it to match. So this is kind of the generic minimum version of the presentation you're getting today. The goal of a presentation like this and the workshops that follow is to prepare a customized, detailed set of playbooks that capture your decisions, plans, precautions, and any expected countermeasures that is ready for action from the moment the crisis of a ransomware event has begun. So we'll be looking at the topics mentioned in the list, starting with, on the next slide, why is ransomware important? Well, let's look at some numbers. One of the biggest issues, of course, is that if a ransomware attack is successful, it can stop your business in its tracks to the level that potentially it could be what we call a business extinction level event. That means your business fails to recover from the event. And this has happened to a number of businesses. For example, a psychology practice in Finland. The frequency of the attacks is increasing almost daily. The technology of prevention, I would argue, has failed. That is, using technology alone to prevent ransomware attacks, because we just use the evidence of our eyes. The average downtime because of ransomware attacks, 21 days. 287 days to fully recover from an attack. And victims paid $350 million in 2020. That went up quite a bit over the previous year. The average payment in 2020 is recorded as $312,000. And in 2020, 2,400 US-based government, healthcare, and schools were victims of ransomware, and now it's spreading to other institutions as well. And since 2019, data from 2,103 companies has been leaked onto the dark web by 34 different ransomware gangs. So the numbers show us this is a serious problem. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here are some of the leakers I mentioned. These are the most popular ransomware gangs, of which there are 34 of them. As I mentioned, 2,100 victims, and these are just the ones who have leaked stolen data onto the internet. So it's something which is significant. On to the next slide, please. So let's look at the characteristics of a ransomware attack. Next, please. So ransomware, as most of us know, it's malware that's designed to encrypt, delete, and sometimes exfiltrate data using hostile techniques. Starting from the break-in, the hijacker will look for information of value. They will usually encrypt, delete, and exfiltrate. By the way, could I ask anyone who still has their microphone on to please switch off? Thank you. I wanted to mention there is at least one modern ransomware gang which is not encrypting data. In other words, they're just relying on exfiltration as their primary source of revenue. Next, after encrypting or deleting and exfiltrating the data, they engage with the victim. That means get some sort of secure communications channel and try to begin the negotiation. What's the victim going to do? Well, you have a choice. You either pay the ransom or you don't pay the ransom. And if you pay the ransom, your attacker has a choice. You could decrypt the data or make the data available again. Of course, there are wrinkles in that. Could I ask once more for people with their microphones on to please switch them off? Thank you. If you don't pay the ransom, then you're faced with a number of alternatives. Your data could be published, your data could be put completely beyond use, and you could see extortion of your own customers or clients. Let's move on, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let's look at some of the recent victims. AXA in May 2021, AXA Insurance. This is a major insurer who provides ransomware insurance. Shortly after they announced that they wouldn't be insuring ransomware payments anymore or making payments, they were hit by some significant attacks. Not just ransomware, but also distributed denial of service attack. Also, as most of you have probably heard, the Colonial Pipeline was forced to pay out just under $5 million. It was actually less than that because of the drop in value of Bitcoin. The hacking collective DarkSide stopped the flow of oil because Colonial's, not the pipeline system, not the industrial systems, but the billing system was compromised. So Colonial shut down their pipeline because they didn't have any way to charge their customers. As someone from New Zealand, I'm keen on what happens in that part of the world. This month, just last week, the Waikato District Health Board was attacked by a consortium called Conti. And this same consortium attacked the Irish Health Service. So two healthcare things in the same week from the same group. In the Irish case, they've been charged or threatened or extorted with a 20 million fee to release the data again. And of course, last month there was the Washington police who received a demand for $4 million in a 250 gigabyte leak. Some of that data is starting to come out already. And of course, there are many more happening every day. Let's move on to the next, please. So some of the latest trends, we're seeing more targeting of specific types of victims, like health, police, multinational companies, infrastructure. Affiliates are being used. Specialists in the ransomware life cycle are handling different parts of the attack. We're seeing a lot more increase of disclosure of data onto not just dark websites, but also public website leaks are occurring. And some of the interesting techniques that are being used, they're now trying out double encryption to see if that increases ransom payments. That is, they're encrypting the data twice. So you encrypt the data, you pay to decrypt it, and you find your decrypted files are encrypted again. So you have to pay twice. Of course, there's the threats to publish the data if the ransom was not paid. That's the classic, which is known as double extortion. And then they started targeting the data subjects, the people who are your customers, your users, your employees. And they were targeted and threatened that their individual data would be released unless they paid directly. And of course, that's called triple extortion. And it really damages the trust in you as an owner or data controller for your users and data subjects. Attacks are definitely getting more frequent. Attackers are becoming more experienced. We read recently about how new members of these criminal gangs are actually conducting formal job interviews, looking for people with the skills. It's a business, but it's a criminal international business. They're using, of course, psychological techniques to apply pressure, attacking twice, hitting with distributed denial of service attacks, making threats. It goes on. They're targeting larger organizations now rather than smaller because the larger ones have bigger profits, of course. And some of them have actually started donating money to charity to clean up their image. They've been publishing examples of that. We're also seeing, as a result of this pipeline event, an increase in scrutiny, not just from the US, also the UK and internationally, from law enforcement and legislative teams. Because of this, there is a higher risk in the business. There's been a growth of data leak marketplaces standing up on the dark web. These are marketplaces that are just there to trade in data. They even claim, oh, we had nothing to do with that break-in, but we've got the data for sale. We'll sell it to anyone who wants to buy it. There's also a marketplace for ransomware itself, and they even offer tech support to their affiliates or licensees. The pipeline attack was not the ransomware group. It was actually an affiliate that handled that. And of course, distributed denial of service attacks are being used as leverage. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So what should you do after you've had a ransomware attack? Well, half of US businesses are estimated that they're going to have to deal with a ransomware attack. We don't have any stats like that for the UK, but it's a significant number. There's plenty of advice out there on the technical side of what you can do to prevent attacks. But as promised, we're not focusing on the technology in this. We're going to be looking at what do you need from a business and legal and operational perspective to prepare for the time that your technology fails. Because that's what a ransomware attack is. The moment you see that notification, your data has been encrypted, the attack is over. All of your technical measures to prevent the attack have failed at that point. So you're faced with choices. Do you pay the ransom? Do you restore from backups? What's the criminal going to do next in terms of countermeasures? Are they going to run distributed denial of service attacks against you? Should you use a decryption tool if that's available either from the attacker or from third-party specialist providers? Well, let's look at the options. Paying the ransom. It's not necessarily the best option. Maybe it's the right choice. Let's look at some of the factors in terms of damage to individuals or financial harm to the business. How critical is your data to your business success. How badly do you want it? Is it legal in your jurisdiction to pay a ransom? Anti-money laundering and combating the funding of terrorism laws, such as 6th AML CFT directive in Europe, and of course in the US you've got the US Patriot Act, and other law, may soon be outlawing ransom payments. This is currently under active scrutiny and investigation. It was the result of a report that was commissioned a month or so ago in the ransomware task force in the US, and currently the UK government is looking at modifying the Computers Misuse Act to potentially outlaw ransom payment. Insurers. AXA decided this month that they would no longer pay ransoms. Beazley, however, is still paying. They're a UK-based reinsurer who are paying ransoms. If you're going to pay, do you have your crypto coins stockpiled? Well, if you were smart and listened to me 5 years ago, you would have stockpiled your cryptos when I first recommended this. And you'd probably be in a very wealthy position now. But even now, it's likely cryptos are going to go up in value. So you'll probably want to have a stockpile of that to save a lot of money in the future, potentially. Over 96% of ransoms are paid in Bitcoin. The rest are paid in things like Monero, which is harder to trace. Now, if you're paying the ransom, you're trusting criminals. Can you really trust a criminal gang? Why don't they just ask for more money? Double encryption, that's a thing, it exists. One example is the city of Baltimore. They refused to pay a ransom, very principled stand, back in 2019. They paid out $91,000. They ended up paying $18 million to recover just because they wouldn't pay that. They didn't know that. They made the best decision at the time, but that's how it worked out. So does paying a ransom work? 31% of organizations pay. Only 8% of that 31% get all their data back, and less than a third don't get more than half of their encrypted data back. So think about the question, should you pay the ransom? That's one of the things you go into in detail in these seminars or workshops. Restoring from backup. Let's look at it from a data perspective. Do you really know which of your data is critical? What is critical to your survival? Have you taken care of analyzing your data situation? Do you know the backup cycle of your systems? How effective is your restoration process? Can you tolerate losing some or most of your data, or even all of it? Have you assessed the risk that the ransomware is already in your cloud backup? That is something to take care of. Usually, organizations which have a high level of maturity have a standardized backup restoration process, which is part of your business continuity plan. If it's not, then it should be. And of course, how long does it take? We saw the case of the pipeline company. They paid the 5 million ransom. They got the decryption tool. They ran the decryption tool. It was too slow. So they ended up restoring from backups anyway. So they wasted all that money, arguably. Let's go to the next slide. Any thoughts, Alex? No.
Apart from finding the mute button, no, Paul. I think this next slide is probably the most interesting one from me, as in with the kind of things the criminals do once they've actually taken your information to ransom.
Exactly. Well, of course, we know about the exfiltration and publication. They take a copy of your data, they publish it on a dark net or now even public net sites. They'll threaten you at this point that unless you pay a ransom, this is known as double extortion, they'll exfiltrate your data. The first generation of ransomware, they had single extortion, which means they would just encrypt the data, denying you access to your data. And then they realized maybe they could make more money by releasing your data, and that actually turned out to be the case. And then there's another level beyond that, triple extortion, where the criminals are actually targeting your customers, getting in touch with your customers and saying to them, look, we have your data as an individual, and unless you pay us this much, some smaller amount, then your data is going up onto the dark web. And interestingly enough, this data has value, and there is a marketplace for this. And of course, the third thing that many of these criminals do, they resell control over your network devices into botnets, where they can be running distributed denial of service attacks, generating cryptocurrency, and other sorts of attacks. Moving on. Should you use decryption tools? Well, the software, it's buggy to say the least. Some of it's good, some of it's not good. In the cases where it's buggy, some specialists have been able to find the decryption key and use it to recover the data. That's an increasingly rare possibility, so I wouldn't rely upon it. More profitable ransomware people are going to build quality into their software so they won't have these bugs. And that's why many of the attackers are putting pressure on the ransom attacked company by saying, unless you pay up within 24 hours, we'll release your data, we'll give away your data or delete your data or so on. Next, please. How can you prepare? Well, I promised I wouldn't focus on the technology, but I do have to just at least cover it in one slide. Otherwise, I feel this wouldn't be balanced. 97% of all of the breaches could have been prevented. Could have. And to do that, you need appropriate technical and organizational measures. I won't read through them. You can always look through them yourself, but they're basic things. Vulnerability and patching, multi-factor authentication, microsegmentation, education of staff, threat intelligence. These are the keys to what you need to do to make it more difficult. Now, what if you've already been attacked? Well, the malware's done its job. So now we look at the question, how resilient is your organization to the attack that's underway?
And
Next
Paul,
slide,
I think
please.
this is the key part of what we focus our efforts on, above and beyond the technology. So I think this is probably the most important part of this hour session. So I'm looking forward to this.
So we're going to be talking about several considerations. We're going to be looking in the context of creating a ransomware playbook or multiple playbooks for your organization. They'll focus on communications, digital forensics. We'll be looking at the tactics that you can deploy once the attacker is in the middle of attacking your systems. We'll look at the legal aspects of ransomware and management roles and responsibilities and what decisions need to be made and how and when they can be made. And above all, behavioral factors are key to the success or failure of a ransomware mitigation or resilience program. Next, please. Communication strategy. So it's about getting information to the right people at the right time with the right information. That's how you deal with it. And you've got to be rehearsed. Your strategy, you need to have from the beginning, before the attack, an executive level authorization. All of your communication should be planned in advance and approved in advance. You need clarity on what your resources are, what their roles are, and what they're responsible for. Not just your internal employees, but contractors that you may have on standby, companies that you're working with who can help you to mitigate some of this. You need to be able to talk about your legal obligations, and we'll come to that in a little bit. You'll need to also think about both internal and external comms, not just talking to your customers and stakeholders and business partners, but also your employees, your consultants, your supply chain. Supply chain communications, there is a real risk that that problem can propagate through your supply chain to either your customers or suppliers. Your communications need to be practiced, smooth, rehearsed. All the phone numbers and email addresses need to be there. Have you thought about building a website? You can build it in advance. Have it ready to go from the moment that the ransomware starts. Some organizations even set up a call center, if it's appropriate, to deal with questions from concerned customers. You don't want to waste time spending days building up a call center when you can have it running from the first day. Training, I don't even have to talk about it. It's so critical. Your communications plan, prepared, needs to be practiced. You need to take into account all of your stakeholders, both internal and external. You need to think about the messaging. How are you going to say it? How are you going to release a press statement? What are you going to say to authorities? What are you going to say to your business partners, to your shareholders? All of these comes as part of the communications planning process. And this could be a workshop of one day just by itself, depending on the complexity of communications. Any comments you want to add to this one, Alex?
Well, other than the fact that comms is obviously absolutely vital in getting all of this right, and needs to be planned for in advance. As you say, communicating to the right people is highly important, and I know that we're going to touch upon the importance of dealing with the authorities and communicating with the authorities in a timely. It's not just communicating the right information, but doing it in a timely manner. We'll talk about shortly. But other than that, no, I think you're covering off the key aspects of comms at this stage. Pre-planning comms and practicing them is absolutely vital.
Yeah, it's the old saying, who are you going to call? Attack busters. Next, please. Sorry for the bad jokes. Now, let's talk about forensics. Digital forensics is a key part, not just prior to the attack, but during and after the attack. Before the attack, you should have a strategy, how you're going to do your forensics. You need a plan. Who's your supplier going to be? Do you have internal capabilities? Are you going to retain the services of an external business to manage this forensics? That needs to be part of your forensics playbook. During the vulnerability or during the attack, your priority is going to be secure the vulnerability, find out very quickly how did they get in, but then next you need to know what was the data that was exfiltrated or stolen or viewed or otherwise modified by the attackers. And after your attack, make sure that the vectors were closed, the doors were closed so that you can't get a reoccurrence. That happens frequently. A business will clean out a ransomware infestation, they'll recover their data, they'll start running again, and within hours, the attacker goes in because the same vulnerability is there, or because they added fresh back doors. So you've got to look for those as well. And of course, if you're going to do an official investigation, as some do with police or other authorities, you need to secure your chain of custody of your evidence. So you need a forensic specialist to help you, to guide you in how to do that appropriately. Next, please. Tactical. Now this I'm going to hand over to Alex. He is the tactical master.
I don't know about that, but I think, Paul, to be honest, the tactical considerations really reflect back on the stuff that you've been covering up until now in terms of the digital forensics. I mean, ultimately, the key tactic in all of this is to act quickly. But obviously, if you're going to act quickly, and this is probably the crux of what we're trying to talk about in this hour session, you have to be able to be pre-prepared. As an ex-military man, I know all about drills and plans and drill exercises, and the whole point of that is so that when the balloon goes up, you can take those steps in quick succession, but also with confidence that you know you're heading in at least a direction rather than no direction. Sometimes it might be slightly wrong, but the fact is it's better to be moving forward. So I think everything you've covered off is absolutely right, and what we're going to be covering off is absolutely right. But the underlying principle has to be prepared and move quickly. You have to move quickly. And that's where the predetermined decision frameworks and matrices become really important. One of the other tactical considerations is around limiting the scope of movement. That's both internally and externally. And I think the topics that Paul was talking about earlier, and specifically the triple extortion example, where the extortion isn't on you, it's on your clients. And it's on your reputation with your clients and potentially your employees that are getting attacked. That's why you have to move quickly. That probably could be viewed as a technical move, but fundamentally it's part of your plan. It has to be part of the plan, and you're talking about the individual at the end of it rather than the technology itself. I guess the quality of monitoring is something you need to be prepared for rather than necessarily enacted at this stage, because if you're going to be looking at the quality of your monitoring now, it's slightly too late. But you do need to be monitoring the right data. In essence, to answer Paul's question from the previous slide in terms of the forensics, how do you know what data's been exfiltrated? How do you know how important it is? How do you know where it's gone? You need to have that quality of monitoring in place beforehand as a tactical measure within the greater strategic plan. That equates obviously also to the data collection within that monitoring. You need to gain that evidence of that exfiltration or that encryption. Fundamentally, if you don't know the data's been taken, then you're not going to be in a very good position to even start thinking about recovering. And I think another area, and Paul will be more than happy to talk at length on that final point, is about having your teams ready to go and set up and prepared. Specifically in this case, we've pulled out the data protection team. They need to be ready to be mobilized, and not just mobilized within 72 hours, because actually the communications with the regulatory bodies needs to be responded to in that kind of timeline. And so you need to have your teams and people ready to go should the balloon go up. It goes across this piece, but pulling out data privacy specifically, because fundamentally that's probably one of the key areas of notification and communications that are going to needs to be done at speed. I don't know, Paul, if there's anything you want to add in terms of other tactical areas at this stage.
Just I want to reinforce that the scope of movement, the vertically and horizontally or laterally, is really about limiting what the attacker can reach within the network. They might have infected your billing network, but maybe they didn't get to your back office network or your manufacturing network. So you've got to really know how you're going to lock down internally, even if it constrains some of your current processing activities. You've got to be prepared to shut off parts of your systems to prevent that lateral movement within the organization. And vertical movement, we mean customers and suppliers. Your supply chain is particularly vulnerable. So you've got to look at that, not just this, but also branches and affiliates. You might have a multinational corporation like AXA, for example. Their branch in Thailand was hit this week. It spread to some of the other Asian branches, but hasn't gone to the European branches because they were able to lock down and prevent that lateral and vertical movement. And of course, the 72 hours is a legal consideration, and that's what we're going to cover in the next slide. So currently, it's not illegal to pay ransoms, but if the ransomware actors have been identified as having links to a terrorist group, then you can bet your bottom dollar or Bitcoin that anti-money laundering and combating the funding of terrorism laws will come into play. These are international laws, not just one state. Here in the UK Computer Misuse Act is being reviewed, and that will outlaw, probably, ransom payments under certain circumstances. So, for example, recently there was a state law in the US which brought in that state government entities must not pay ransoms. But of course, private companies are given the choice, well, you can do it if you want to, but not state. Personal data. If you've determined that personal data of your customers or employees or partners was in that tranche of data that was exfiltrated, then you have 72 hours to report those breaches. And of course, it's not just GDPR. There are other regulations around the world with mandatory breach reporting obligations. Both the US and the UK governments have strongly recommended in recent weeks against paying a ransom. And of course, last year, US entities should follow the OFAC from the Treasury guidance on ransomware payments. Let's move on to the next. Now we're going to look at privilege. This is, I won't go too much into this because this is technical and there aren't that many lawyers who are necessarily interested in this topic, but basically there are two types of privilege: solicitor-client privilege and litigation privilege. Both of them come into play during a ransomware data breach attack or any sort of significant data breach. So best practices for protecting privilege during the attack: be prepared. Sounds familiar? Yeah. Consult your counsel immediately. Talk to your internal and external legal advisors. Have them prepared and ready to be able to answer these sorts of questions. Maybe even set up separate legal teams. One legal team just focusing on the privilege aspects. And of course, any privilege has to be protected in relation to communications with third-party providers, your internet providers, your service providers, security providers. All of those communications are privileged. This means controlling carefully the distribution and disclosure of any privileged advice and documents in relation to the cyber attack. And of course, if it's an international data breach, then you need to think about engaging foreign counsel to help you because, of course, foreign privilege rules may differ from what you're used to within your jurisdiction. And the final part, even more interesting, is this concept of contributory negligence. This is an abstruse legal concept. There's even movies about it, but you can learn about it, of course. Victims of major ransomware attacks, which have had a significant financial effect, are highly likely to be targeted by contributory negligence lawsuits, class action lawsuits. Contributing negligence is the plaintiff's failure to exercise reasonable care for their own safety. You can expect there's going to be a lot of class action lawsuits. The damages for those are going to be awarded proportionately based on the amount of negligence of each of the contributing parties. What degree did they contribute? And of course, the biggest contribution for a company like Colonial, the pipeline company, they're going to be liable for a significant portion of damages because they contributed, quote, contributed heavily to the severity of the breach by failing to adequately protect itself from the cyber attack. And there's a lot of evidence around that. What were the measures they used? They didn't patch, they had existing vulnerabilities, they didn't have the right people, they didn't invest the budget into the data cybersecurity practice. That would all be counted in a lawsuit as a failing to adequately protect itself from a cyber attack. And of course, if you need to defend claims like that, you need privilege. So see earlier. Thank you. Let's move on to the next. Roles and responsibilities. Before the incident occurs, you need to have a plan. Who's going to lead it? Who's going to guide it? Should it be the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer? Well, I would argue that by the time the ransomware notice pops up on your screen saying, we have all your data encrypted, send money, that at that point, all of your technical solutions under the control of your CTO, and I'm sorry to say this to the CTOs here, by that point, all of your measures have failed, all of your prevention. You've probably invested tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions into prevention, but it's not enough because the attackers, well, you have to get lucky with every attack. They only need to get lucky once. So the decisions after the attack are going to be primarily logistical, legal, comms, and financial. You need to understand the risks. You need to be prepared to take decisions to mitigate the impact of the incident. Mitigations such as pay the ransom, don't pay the ransom, decrypt versus restore from backup, microsegment, unplug servers, switch off servers. These are all strategic decisions which impact your business and must be analyzed in detail beforehand with the risk. So let's take an example. Who decides whether a ransom is going to be paid or not? How much will they pay? I don't think it's the job of the CTO. Perhaps your CEO or CFO would be the best choice. The point here is that roles and responsibilities should be defined in advance. Look at the different scenarios, document the levels of responsibility, the budget, the scope for all of the resources that you need to bring in to mitigate, and put it in your plan ahead of time. Next, please. And now I would like to hand over to Alex to talk about behaviors and maybe misbehaviors too.
No. I mean, I think we've established the importance of having a playbook and having playbooks that account for the decision-making process, so you can react quickly and you can react with resilience to a ransomware attack, and you can make best use of it. Behavioral factors come into two areas. The behavioral factor, obviously, in terms of dealing with the incident, but also actually, this is in preparation, the behavioral factors in the context that realistically in this day and age, the technology is less targeted than individuals are in the initiation of these attacks. And so whilst this isn't directly related to trying to help you guys and in the audience and your organizations develop the playbooks, I think it's an important angle to understand and take away as well, that if you're preparing to face ransomware attacks, you need to start thinking about the individuals within your organization, the security culture, the secure by default, the context and the concept that people, I guess from a social engineering perspective, verify before trusting, that you're developing that culture, that behavioral sense within the organization where the click here for a free Starbucks isn't automatically clicked on. And I think that's an important element to understand when you are preparing to face ransomware attacks. So we just really wanted to bring that in, and I think I said in my introduction, really it kind of sits quite nicely with where we feel our strengths are as a company around that human-centric digital transformation. In this case, we're thinking about human-centric protection and defense against these attacks. I think one of the things to bear in mind is probably the fact that you need to do an element of a risk assessment across the board as well, because clearly people with higher levels of privilege, as it says on the slide there, will probably need a little bit more training, because clearly they're open if they are vulnerable to attack and they are attacked and they let the criminals in. Clearly the lateral movement that Paul was talking about earlier and the vertical movement is much more freely achieved. But fundamentally across the board, there's a need, I believe personally, to grow the maturity of security culture around organizations everywhere. I'd
just like to add to that. One example, one war story that I didn't want to put in here, but it might be relevant. Several years ago, working in Eastern Europe, I was working in the banking financial sectors, particularly high-risk areas. This is a sector where we would do, for example, live fire exercises, moving and shooting in a training range. In this situation, it was high stakes. The bank knew that there were blended attacks taking place. In other words, there would be situations where armed men would do a home invasion. They would take away the bank manager to the branch of his bank early before dawn and use extortionate threats of violence against the family of the bank manager to hand over passcodes, secret passwords, and keys to the money or cash or transfers that existed within that banking environment. So that's something to really think about, that we're seeing this blended type of attack coming more and more in future. Another example, Bitcoins. There was a case where there was, and you can Google this, a robbery, a home invasion, where the individual who had the password for a lot of Bitcoins was tortured for that information. And the transfer was done then and there by the attackers, and they did not leave that home until they got that Bitcoin transferred into their own wallet. So, Alex, back to you for the summary.
Indeed. I think the key thing to bear in mind is, I mean, we've been talking for 50 minutes, and we have literally just scraped the surface of what is required, we believe, to be ready to take on a ransomware attack when probably is more likely than if these days it happens. I think hopefully there's a common understanding of the insidious nature of attacks from the examples that we've been giving earlier on, that there is an understanding that technology as a solution is probably a false paradigm in this day and age, that's both in terms of the vectors of attack, i.e. people, but also in terms of providing that defense once you've realized you've been under attack. And that really it's ultimately ransomware and dealing with ransomware is not a CTO or a technology issue, it's a business problem. I think Paul alluded to it earlier. Ransomware very, very easily can become an extinction event. And that's not just literally from the fact that they could take your money out of your banks today, but the reputational cost with your clients can very quickly turn clients and other businesses away from dealing with you. And there are numerous examples that we can go into on that, possibly on another day in another call. So fundamentally, in summary, yep, technology, possibly not the correct focus point, process, planning, and getting a decent playbook to deal with the event once it's occurred, and getting the right ownership and the right people in place at the right time. Hopefully in this last 50 odd minutes, we've given you some ideas around that and some thoughts, and maybe something to provoke some thoughts or possibly even questions, which we'll open up in a second. But I guess we just like to say that if you want to talk more, please do get in touch with us. We do ransomware simulations. We hold workshops in order to take what we're given across today and turn into something that is tangible, practicable, and usable in the sense of providing you with those playbooks to support reaction to the attacks as and when they happen.